First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today for Down the Rabbit Hole, how social media is designed to radicalize its users. For those of you who may not be familiar with the work of Issue One and the Council for Responsible Social Media, CRSM brings together a multi-sectoral group of individuals, including myself and the members of this panel, who are focused on finding solutions to the technological harms that are happening to our kids, our communities, and national security as a result of social media. And the Council is seeking to elevate bipartisan conversation and advance impactful, achievable solutions. We have more than 50 members, and they're all doing incredibly important work, and we're grateful to have them. A core focus of CRSM is that the risks that social media poses to our national security and to our democracy, which brings us to the subject of today's panel. So social media platforms are designed to maximize our attention. They are sucking us in and keeping us hooked. They do this by keeping the public in the dark about how algorithms elevate certain content and pushing people deeper and deeper into echo chambers. People are being pulled further away from the political center and are finding it increasingly difficult to view less radical content in some cases. In the worst instances, users are sent down a rabbit hole where the most inflammatory and extremist content, including false information frequently promoted by our foreign adversaries like China and Russia, is being advanced. And the result is a polarized electorate and an information environment poisoned with false information. Authoritarian regimes and domestic bad actors alike have seized on this vulnerability, exploiting it to promote their own view of the world and to divide Americans. Terrorist organizations around the world use these platforms to indoctrinate and then recruit people to their extreme causes. And today, we are joined by three experts who have focused on these fields from different perspectives. And we're so excited to have with us Farah Pandith, the author and senior advisor at the Anti-Defamation League. She's also an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a foreign policy strategist, and a former diplomat. Sasha Havliceck, CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, is an expert advisor to the United Kingdom's Counter-Extremism Commission and the Mayor of London's Counter-Extremism Program. She's also a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And last but certainly not least, we have Secretary Michael Chertoff, who's a member of the National Council on Election Integrity, co-founder and executive chairman of the Chertoff Group, and of course, former Secretary of the US Department of Homeland Security and a federal judge on the US Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. So welcome to all of our speakers today. And we're so lucky to have you, not only on the council, but to give us your thoughts today on this important topic. So Sasha, I'd like to begin with you, and I'd like to begin this conversation before we open it up to the panel, just to have you reflect on, over the past 7 years, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue has been doing extensive research on online hate and extremism. So based on what we know now, what are the main extremist threats that we're facing in the current social media landscape? And beyond that, how do these threats differ when you compare the US and the UK?
Harry, thank you so much. And as you well know, we've been identifying and monitoring extremist hate and disinformation threats to public safety and to democracy around the world now for actually over a decade and a half. And I wanted to start by just saying we've seen an enormous transformation and a growth of that threat landscape from a time when extremism and hate was characterized largely by disconnected, smaller fringe groups online, to a time now where we see massive interconnected online subcultures uniting often across a broad church around common goals, objectives, and able to translate online mobilization effectively into offline action. And ultimately what we've seen is the mainstreaming of extremism. And we live at a time now where violence is inspired not just by the fringe and by organizations, so terrorist organizations, hate groups, but is inspired across this interconnected ecosystem of online subcultures very effectively, making us less secure and vulnerable. And I will say it's important to note, because we often talk about the online as if it is its own unique world. Online spikes that we identify and monitor track in hate and extremism and so on, track very clearly with offline spikes in both violence, but also in polarization and threats to democracy that we see at various moments in various parts of the world today. So the transformation and augmentation of this threat environment results really from four problems that we've seen. Now, one is the failure of large social media platforms to systematically enforce their own rules in respect of these threats. They have rules, terms of their own rules on these threats. And I can give you a ton of data to show where those failings lie. And I'll come back to that in a second. Second is, possibly worse, and you've identified this, is that our research, others' research has shown that platforms amplify and recommend some of the most potentially harmful content to some of the most susceptible, sometimes vulnerable users, inorganically amplifying the content that comes closest to that red line of what is acceptable, which is essentially not a free speech environment. We talk about free speech. I want free speech, but this is a curated speech environment in which these platforms essentially decide who sees what based on that attention economy model. The third problem is the hybridization of the threat landscape. It's important to understand you can no longer talk just about a hate group, an extremist group in isolation. The kind of amplification we see through everything from hostile state actors to commercial actors of these types of ecosystems of hate and extremism, the full grab bag of tactics that we came to associate with the Kremlin in 2016, that grab bag of tactics is in everybody's hands now. And those state actors are professionalizing the space in terms of inauthentic, coordinated efforts to polarize, to sow hate, and sometimes directly extremism. Some of the work that we've done more recently on Iranian information operations, extremely dangerous, and of course, rising in respect of what's happening in the Middle East today. And finally, I will say, to add insult to injury, this is the fourth point, we've experienced, in the context of this rise of the threat landscape, a progressive shuttering of platform data access for the research community, making this kind of malign activity on the platforms more and more obscure.
And Sasha, for many years, you had access to that information. Is that not correct?
Well, we've had better API, better computational access to data across many of the platforms than we do today. They've been closing those access points, if you like, for computational analysis, which means that we can do innovative things to get a sense of what's happening, but we're not seeing the full picture. And this is really problematic because we can't get a sense of the proportion of the threat on specific platforms or on a cross-platform basis, which makes them more obscure to all of us and us all much less secure.
And so far, not far, I'm sorry, Sasha, let's stick with you for just a second. You recently moved your base of operation that had been in London and working in Europe for many years, also to the US. So what kind of differences are you seeing in the kinds of threats that are manifesting in the US than the ones that you were confronting when you were working primarily with Europe?
The big difference, it boils essentially down to regulation. So we now have, finally, in Europe, something that ISD has been working on for years and years and with partners and with governments, we now have a major regulatory package, the Digital Services Act, coming into effect at the EU level. And for the very first time, we're able to take a prevention approach to these problems, which is to say, we're not just talking about the removal of bits of content, the kind of whack-a-mole problem, which I think hits up often with discussions around free speech in the United States. We're talking about making the platforms responsible for the kinds of risks that they really need to be getting their heads around on their platforms. And so they are now mandated to do audited risk assessments to get ahead of the curve. There is no excuse for platforms to be saying, we didn't know this was going to happen. An election, a crisis, we know that in these contexts, we have an uptick of these types of threats. These kinds of risk-based approaches mean that platforms will have to be more prepared. But it's also another thing. I mean, we have just found, we think of just the sort of wider gray area of content being a problem these days. The sharp tip of terrorist and violent, illegal branded terrorist content is still a problem online. Just now, a few months back, around October, my team did an analysis of branded terrorist content across a number of mainstream platforms. We saw a huge uptick, this content reaching millions of people. Irrespective of Article 230, this is illegal content in a US context too. Why isn't it coming down? Not only was it there for finding, but it wasn't actioned 3 months after it was flagged. Why? Because in an EU context now, a European context, we have levers. We can now go and take that kind of data to the regulators, and they will fine the platform significantly for this kind of breach. It means that they're a little bit more on the front foot with it. It means that they're looking to try and prevent these things going forward. But it also means we finally have some transparency.
So can I bring in Secretary Chertoff here just and say why is this not happening in the U.S.? Why do we not have this same ability?
Well, I think in the U.S., obviously there's a big concern about the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Now, sometimes that's interpreted very, very broadly. But whenever the government in particular gets involved in dealing with the issue of speech, including hate speech, there become serious legal questions about the authority to do that. Now, I think actually you can be a little bit more specific about what is protected and what is unprotected. But often the rhetoric, certainly in front of Congress, does not get to that level of subtlety. But there are things you could regulate that are not simply the content of speech, but which, as Sasha said, contribute a great deal to the weaponization of speech, even if it's not content itself.
So I'd like to turn to Farah now and ask her, you've done a lot of research around how different groups are radicalized and sort of the demographics of radicalization. You've looked at millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who are all very, actually pretty conversant, with social media, have different types of relationships with social media, and also with the differences in terms of how women and men interact with these kinds of this kind of information online. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you think these harms differ across different demographics?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carrie. I do want to make a point on two things that Sasha said, however, before I pivot. One is, one is really the aspect of consciousness within culture about how serious this threat really is, and what moves you to a place where civil society understands that there is a threat environment that can prey upon children, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, young people who are growing up. That consciousness in the United States has been slow. It's been slow from both regular people who live their normal lives. 50% of Gen Z is on TikTok every single day. I don't have to give the numbers of how mainstream it is to see and watch a young person go back and forth in their lives online versus offline. But that point is really important because we are not seeing the kind of response from regular people on what's happening with their children. There's no consciousness that says they're pushing Congress to make harder decisions about what's taking place with regulation, with what is permissible, how we think about hate and extremism. Forget about terrorist organizations, forget about non-state actors, forget about the Chinas and Russias who are manipulating with propaganda and disinformation. Let's just talk about daily life for a young person who is maturing, who is going through an identity exploration, as we all did when we're growing up. Identity and belonging are central to whether or not you are 12 or you're 19, you're thinking about yourself. And so how these young people explore their identity and search for belonging is a central point to the way in which they find content of interest. And so bad actors will prey upon different social media platforms depending on where these folks go. It is not, Gen Z is not on Facebook. They're on other platforms, whether it's Discord or Instagram, whether it's Snapchat or whatever platform that they use. There is a bespoke attempt to go after a 7-year-old versus a 19-year-old, but versus a 21-year-old, based on what they know will make sense for that particular generation, all of whom are obviously digital natives. So it is important to state very, very clearly that not only have we been slow to the game in getting serious about what's taking place with our young people in America, but secondly, this consciousness of if you would want to call it marketing, if you could even do that, the luring in of a young person that comes forward. We think differently when it's cigarettes. We think differently when it's child exploitation vis-a-vis sexual assault or nudity. And this week in Congress, we saw front and center, finally, Congress getting serious about these issues. But we have to understand that whether or not it's a soft approach by an ISIS recruiter for a teenage girl in Oregon who begins that recruitment by talking about lipstick color and nail polish, moving into their likes for music, that gets them interested in having a conversation with the person on the other end of that screen, whether that's whether it is a person that is a peer or it is somebody older. They know what they're doing when they're manipulating the content that they are sharing. So what we need to be conscious of is, indeed, there is a difference between what's happening to millennials and what's happening to Gen Z and what's happening to Gen Alpha. Of course there is. There's also a difference between male and female, those who find different kinds of content around identity and belonging interesting. That's the hook. That's what brings people in. So of course there's going to be a difference in the way you're luring them in. I think that we have been slow as the United States to get really serious about those nuances on. Sasha brought up the word prevent, and I'm going to use that again. How do we prevent? It's not just taking down. How do we prevent the appeal of that ideology to these different groups in different ways? And I think that fundamentally, for me, is the most serious gap in the way that we've been thinking about the issue at hand. Because, as Sasha just said, hate is not decreasing. Extremism is not decreasing.
So, but how do you prevent it? I mean, that obviously that's a goal. That's a good goal. But how do you do it? What is the practical approach?
Right. So the first is the consciousness that this is happening, the conversation that is happening both in government and non-government, that something needs to be done. I would argue that that is not happening at the scale that it needs to happen. Of course, there are people in our government and outside of our government who have trying to wave a flag that says we got to get more serious, but you're not seeing the commitment as a priority area. That shows up in the funding that is required for NGOs that are doing the first responses to all of this. They come up with the creative ways. It doesn't show up in the way in which we can scale solutions that we know. And I will turn to Sasha because of the incredible work that ISD has done on prevention. But I would say, Carrie, I know we're going to have a deeper conversation on what are the solutions. The solutions are available. We're not in a situation where we're wringing our hands to say, what do we do about this? We have experimented with content that can move a person from one way to another. We have experimented with how to push algorithms in a different way. We have understood, even through some of the legal mechanisms that Sasha was just talking about, what can be done to contain the ability for social media companies to allow that exploitation of young people.
So let me bring Secretary Chertoff in, because you've looked at so many threats to the U.S. and when you're thinking about that, those myriad threats, how does online extremism compare to the other things that the U.S. faces, the other threats that you've seen?
Well, Carrie, when we dealt with 9/11 and in the immediate period thereafter, we were dealing, first of all, with global terrorism, and it tended to be very hierarchical. It was quite organized. You had bin Laden, who was almost a micromanager of terrorism. Obviously, the scale of what they did was tremendous and horrible, but it also was a vulnerability because the more they had to communicate with each other and coordinate, the more opportunities we had to collect and intercept plans before they were actually carried to fruition, which is one of the reasons that we have not seen large-scale post 9/11 attacks being successful. But then the model moved to what I call terrorism 2.0, which is smaller groups, and 3.0, which is online recruitment and simply directing people to go out on their own and carry out terrorist attacks. The scale of that kind of terrorism is less than the 9/11, obviously, but it's much more difficult to intercept because you're trying to get into very, very thin lines of communication and do it very, very rapidly. So we've seen an evolution.
That evolution of the threat that you're facing, who's best positioned to respond to that in its current form? I mean, I presume you have to continue to keep looking for the larger organizations and the smaller cells, but now you have this additional burden as well.
Well, I think that there are things government can do, but a lot of it is the private sector. The entities which are managing the profiles have visibility into who is saying and doing what on the profiles. And they should exercise a responsibility, certainly if you're getting into what I call direct incitement or preparation. There's no free speech issue there. That's just part of a crime. But even if you're dealing with something subtler, recruitment, propaganda, I think the platforms have the right, the editorial right, to curate what is on their platforms. And I don't think that is a violation of the First Amendment because it's not the government. The irony is the government is a little more hamstrung in terms of what it can do because of the Constitution than the private sector is. But I also think there are a couple of areas that we could look at that are not implicated by the First Amendment. First, we were talking about the algorithms, and I don't think algorithms are protected by the Constitution. But the real question is, how do you build algorithms using artificial intelligence? And the answer is one word: data. You collect data at humongous scale, you analyze it very, very specifically, and then you use that to target people on exactly what their hot buttons are. And people don't realize how much information about their thought process is available to platforms, particularly those that integrate and accumulate them and use it as a way of, for example, building a model of who they want to target. Everything you look at, and they even have a capability to see where your eyeballs are resting when you're watching a television show. Every place you go, what you search for online, all of this can be assembled and often is assembled and can be used to give you a particularly targeted message that no one else will see because it would offend other people, but happens to touch on something that is your concern. I do think we could regulate access to data, uses of data, and the application of algorithms to that data without offending the First Amendment. Another issue is identity. A lot of the activity that occurs online is people impersonating your friends or people that you respect when it's really somebody sitting in St. Petersburg or Tehran. And again, the platforms have the ability and should have the obligation to unmask phony personas or impersonation. So I think those are some of the tools that are available, not to eliminate the problem, but to mitigate it and make it harder to have very curated efforts to recruit and operationalize extremism.
So let's bring in, Sasha, you want to jump in, please?
I just wanted to jump in on this because I couldn't agree more. The bottom line is that now European regulators, the European public, and European researchers will in fact get that access to data that is the sine qua non for us to understand algorithmic impact. Not trade secrets and the algorithm itself, but algorithmic impact, what the algorithms are doing in terms of these harms on society. Right now, nobody, except for the platforms themselves, have that data access. And there's about to be a data divide, a transparency divide across the Atlantic between European regulators, European researchers, where, by the way, researchers, not just regulators, will have access, creating an ecosystem of scrutiny that also helps us with things like over-moderation. So for free speech purposes, it's equally important as it is for security and risk purposes. But we will have that at an EU level, and we are not getting it here. And that's going to be a really big disjoint. I will just say the rabbit hole piece. Should bots, should algorithmic amplification or promotion be protected in some shape or another from in the context of laws today? Should they really, is free speech intended to apply to them? It would seem not. They're distortive of free speech. They're distortive of the information ecosystem environment. So we really need to get at those aspects of behavior and the systems that distort the information ecosystem right now.
All right, so you were talking about the bots, and I'd like to add in the overlay of AI and how AI has simply, thrown gasoline on the social media influence and amplified it. We've seen this in Ukraine. We've seen it after October 7th and the Hamas attack. How social media can become a breeding ground for deep fakes and AI fueled disinformation. I'd like to start with Farah, but I'd really like to hear from all of you, how you're thinking about the impact of AI fueled social media on democracy.
Carrie, there were more than 500,000 deepfakes in 2023 online. The percentage of people in the United States who say that they think that they know a deepfake versus others is really very low. You can't tell the difference when things are taking place. You don't have the digital know-how. We have really failed in providing digital hygiene to parents and to kids. So they don't know, first of all, what algorithms do the way they should. They don't understand what is real and what is not real. They can't distinguish between fake videos, obviously online, that are saying that there's an end of the world or the president of the United States is calling for whatever it is, versus something that isn't true. We're watching at the speed of light people building conspiracy theories. I mean, January 6th is a great example of the power of these ideas, where people really believed that things were taking place, to come to our nation's capital to attack it, to protect it in their minds. And I find it really extraordinary that 2 years after this event, we're still in a situation where we have not, as Americans, stood up to say, let's have a deeper conversation about mis and disinformation, because it pushes upon the very bottom line with regard to democracy and who we are, and giving people an opportunity to celebrate the Constitution, as opposed to tearing it down because they don't understand what is actually happening around them. I think that what we see with regard to deepfakes and all of the propaganda is a very serious component to national security as a threat. I think that Americans have not been, their eyes have not opened to what that really is. And I think it is really important, some of the data that we have about how progressive AI is, for both good and for bad, needs to be engaged on this issue of the growth of hate and extremism. Carrie, there are almost 1,200 hate and extremist groups just in the United States alone. Okay. And one thing that we have learned in the 22 years since 9/11 is how well these bad actors learn from each other. They are taking the models from different people and understanding how to do it even better. So even if there are ideologies that are not are not, they don't love each other. You have an ISIS or you have a neo-Nazi group. They don't believe in the same thing. You better believe that they're copying each other on how to use tactics that recruit. So they're going to be doing this. Whatever group is able to do it best, you're going to see a growth in that kind of movement. And I think, I really do think that AI can, to go to what Secretary Chertoff was speaking about, can really, if we use it the right way, to understand not just forecasting, but prevention of what somebody may or may not do based on what it is that we see that's happening online.
So Secretary Chertoff, let me bring you into this discussion because, how are you seeing AI change the essence of the threat?
Well, I think in a couple of respects. First of all, as I indicated earlier, AI allows you to apply to huge amounts of data the kind of analytic tools that allow you to separate out who's interested in what and what techniques might be appealing to certain individuals that wouldn't be appealing to others. And the scale is much greater now with AI than would have been the case for human analysts, which is one of the reasons we've seen our foreign adversaries, for example, the Chinese, accumulating millions and millions of terabytes and gigabytes of data, which they can only analyze by using a version of AI as a way of seeing who is vulnerable to recruitment, who is worried about certain things, and how do you curate your messages to tickle just those particular areas that apply to a certain individual. But I think there's a larger issue with AI in terms of our security. We've been talking about deep fakes, and they've gotten quite effective. You can have I think you've had audios that purport to be Joe Biden telling people not to go vote in the primaries. You've had fake videos. But what's pernicious about this is not just the deep fakes themselves, but it now gives people an opportunity to discredit real videos and audios by saying, oh, that's a fake. So really what deep fakes and AI do is they undermine the core value of democracy and what we call liberal society, which is trust. Because if you can't trust anybody, if you can't trust the healthcare, public health sector, if you can't trust the law and the courts, if you can't trust what you see with your own eyes, then you've got to simply gravitate to people who tell you what you want to believe and who scare you into believing things that are particularly fraud. So I think we need to look at this as part of a larger attack on social cohesion. And, if you go back in history 100 years, before we had all this technology, the Soviets used to have, with Comintern, very elaborate propaganda machines designed to undermine liberal democratic and Western solidarity. Now that's on steroids because you don't have to be particularly skilled to use artificial intelligence to foster mistrust, lack of unity of effort, fear, anger, and hatred. And that's what I think we're seeing now.
So is it possible in this current online environment to de-radicalize the conversation? Sasha, do you see anything coming out of Europe that gives you hope that we might be able to get our arms around it here in the US as well?
Yes, I mean, just to come back, if I may, Kerry, just to this AI point, because my team is in the process of doing a study right now on the use of deepfakes in the context of the Israel-Hamas conflict. And this point that Secretary Chertoff has raised in terms of confirmation bias is a really important one. We're seeing two things. We're seeing people, of course, buy into deepfakes, but we're also seeing people believe that they are seeing a deep fake when it's in fact not fake at all. And people approach this type of content in the same way that they do disinformation writ large. People are essentially looking for what they want to see online and believing what they want to see. And there has been a massive crisis of trust already in the information ecosystem. So this is just a sort of, a complement to that problem. On a slightly more positive note, I will say both that it is a wake-up call, and we're starting to see conversations about regulation being taken quite seriously in the US context because of the magnitude of the AI problem. And there is an intersection here that we need to look at in terms of AI regulation and the sort of information space social media regulation, because after all, they are also the distribution mechanisms for that kind of deepfake content. There, I feel, is a real opportunity now to move towards, to your question, Kerry, in terms of what can be done. I think that we are starting to see a shift in the discussion here in the United States, an awareness, a bigger awareness than ever before of what's missing here. There's three things that we definitely can be doing better and that will help us then get to a place where we can start the de-radicalization process online. Because here's the thing, when we started to do this work at ISD, we came to this thinking, look, we've seen a problem here. Surely we can outcompete the bad with good online. Surely we can have an ideational sort of debate that leads us in the right direction. We realized over time that however well you did counter speech or whatever you wanted to call it, counter narrative work, you couldn't outcompete the bad with the good because the playing field is not level. The algorithmic problem means that everything is essentially tilted in the interest of more sensationalist, extreme content. And that funnel is bringing more and more people into that space, but pushing them into that rabbit hole. That's the problem. It's not level. If we can, number one, we can't leave the platforms to mark their own homework. We know that that hasn't worked. Just around illegal content, they can be doing much better, and we need to regulate it, number one. Number two, we have to be looking at regulating, which means opening the black box, if you like, in terms of the impact of algorithms on these harms, so that we can have a public debate as to what we do with that. And there does need to be regulation in relation to that issue, as well as the distortion from inauthentic activity, fake accounts, botnets, and so on and so forth. So we can stop that.
How important is that transparency for researchers that you were talking about earlier? Because there are bills in front of Congress now that would give that to people in the U.S.
I think that's the sine qua non. I think that's the single biggest thing we could ask for this year. I can't see massive regulatory change of the sort that we've seen in Europe, but the ability just for us to shine the spotlight of transparency on these systems and share that with both the public and with legislators will put us in good stead in terms of making the decisions and the changes that need to happen over time, and will be also a motivator for the platforms to start to do things better themselves. What we saw is that self-regulatory approaches in Europe started to really work once we had the real threat of legislation in place.
So I'd like to move. Okay, I'll go to you, Farah, but I'd like to start moving to solutions. So I'd love to hear what your thinking is, Farah.
Yeah, actually, and that's one of the things I was going to say. I just want to pick up the point that Secretary Chertoff made about trust and social cohesion, because that's part of the solution set. What happens online doesn't begin online, it begins offline. And this point about how we can fix the problem that we are facing today cannot only be a solution set that takes place online with the us versus them ideologies. It has to happen within our societies offline, the way people think about themselves, the way we understand how important it is that pluralism and freedom to express yourself does not mean the diminishing of another human being and their beliefs in a way that is violent or extremist. We have to understand that trust piece is what the bad guys want us to do inside. Of course, Russia and China want to destroy the social fabric of the United States. That's a winning proposition for them. We need to be able to be clear that the effective solutions that we can deploy in schools, in college campuses, in businesses, in the private sector, the way other colleagues talk to each other in a business environment, that has fundamentally changed, Kerry, in America. It is not the same nation it was even 10 years ago. So the attention to solutions have to happen in the way in which we live our lives as Americans and how we think of ourselves and what's important to us, but also what Sasha said about the regulations and the sticks that have to go forward, not just, there may be carrots too, but the sticks that have to be deployed for the social media companies to help us build back this new landscape where trust is not eroding at the pace that it is.
So it's fascinating. You're talking about rebuilding social trust or building it for the first time, and you think about how early these these young children come into the use of social media and how quickly you'd have to do that, we're really talking about curricula that might be needed to be implemented in elementary schools.
Finland is teaching kindergartners about fake information. They have a digital hygiene program for kindergartners. The white supremacist group, Atomwaffen, has publicly stated that they are going after 7-year-old kids. I mean, this is not just fantasy that we think could happen. It is happening right now. So you have a country like Finland who's taking positive actions to say, we want kindergartners to understand that they've got to ask different questions about things that they see. And yet Americans are just like, oh yeah, you know, it's fine. It isn't fine. We're seeing an impact on not just the mental health of young kids, but this issue, which is what we're talking about today, the impact of what our country is going to feel like and what it is for the future if we do not do more right now.
I'd like to give the last few moments here to Secretary Chertoff to talk about solutions, to talk about the things that you would like to see done in this coming year, perhaps, that can push against some of the threats that we've been discussing today.
Well, thank you, Carrie. And I want to agree with Farah. I think a lot of this is about educating, particularly at a young age. You know, one of the unfortunate byproducts of the lockdown that we had during the pandemic was it had little kids not going to school and they were spending more time online. And we have to undo that damage. It's important to have socialization at the community level, at the local school level, because that's how people learn to judge what's real and not real, by looking somebody else in the eyes. If everything is online, it all merges into a kind of a single illusion. I also think, to be honest, the private sector has more of a role to play. And I don't just mean the platforms, but if you're advertising on a platform that is fomenting hate, maybe you ought to ask yourself, do I want to advertise on this platform? And maybe the consumers ought to ask themselves, do I want to buy products from a company that is advertising on a platform full of hate? So just as with anything else in our pluralist society, individuals, community groups, and even private sector businesses can take a stand against deliberate efforts to manipulate with disinformation or to recruit hating. I also think, as I said, I think we can deal with the issue of algorithms in a regulatory way. I think it's particularly critically important for people to be aware how their data is being misused, and to make sure that there are strict boundaries about the ability to misappropriate your data. And I also think another thing we can do as part of the solution is rebuild a credible center. You know, one of the things that was a precursor to the fragmentation that we see on social media was talk radio. I remember when I was really young, you had 3 networks, you had a number of basic radio networks, and they had to position themselves to appeal to a relatively broad group of people. But then you got talk radio, and you could tune into a particular station and only hear what you wanted to hear, like an echo chamber. And then that, of course, set the table for what happened in social media. I'm not saying you ban those kinds of radio stations or social media platforms, because you do have a free country. But what I say is you need to invest in rebuilding a center that over time will earn the trust of good faith people and be an antidote for some of the disinformation that right now seems to be overwhelming our societies.
Well, thank you to all of the panelists. And now we're going to ask Willa Blake to open it up to questions that she's been collecting from the audience. And let's hear what's on the audience's mind. Hello, Willa.
Hi, thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you everyone for being here today. We've had a lot of questions pouring in, so apologies if your question does not get asked. Feel free to follow up through email, and we will do our best. But our first question is from Louisa, and it is, are there any mechanisms in place to flag/counter AI-generated deepfakes of election officials spreading disinformation around the election? For example, your polling location has changed, ... That's an example. Could social media companies be compelled to link the official government sources of information if certain keywords, i.e. polling location, are used?
So
I
let
could
me
start- Michael.
start and say those are great suggestions. We should have, I believe, disclosure. Even when campaigns are using artificially created videos, disclosure is something that ought to be required, that AI has been used to generate this. And I don't think that's a First Amendment problem. I would also go further and say that misinformation about where to vote and how to vote, actually you could ban that, because I don't think that's free speech. I think that's fraud. And it's particularly dangerous when it interferes with our political system.
Do you think something like that could be criminalized?
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
And you could find if a campaign generates that, there could be a fine. And certainly you could make it public. Yeah.
Can I just come on this too? I completely agree that I think that could be criminalized, but I think there are things that the social media companies could be compelled to do, similar to what they were compelled to do around the COVID, around the pandemic sort of response, and that is to sort of surface, if you like, and make sure that the first bit of content people get is factual from factual sources. But I think there's a bigger challenge here, and it is something that we're looking at in depth. Can we work with networks of those people on the front line of the elections, state secretaries in their teams, election officials in their teams, officialdom across the sort of election space, law enforcement? The people who will be most likely to be targeted by deepfakes are the most likely, and their officers are the most likely to see it first. And I think we're very keen, because we're doing a lot of work on election protection this year, and we're doing a lot of work at that state level, to create some kind of an aggregator, a kind of flagging system, a ticketing system that would enable us to aggregate that data and quickly get that both verified and then actioned by social media companies in the way that Secretary Chertoff spoke of. I do think that that's doable, but it means coordination. So we must all connect the dots and work together on that side of things until we move to a place where we have better authentication of content. The technical solutions, the technological solutions are still not quite there, and the regulatory solution, of course, is still not there when it comes to AI.
Thank you, guys. Great responses. I think this is a good segue into our next question, which is from Rihanna. And she asked, I'll start with Farah, but everyone can answer this. How do you evaluate the efficacy of de-radicalization and rehabilitation programs, such as those employed in Germany? And could those be implemented in the US to address extremism and radicalization?
Such a good question. I will say, because Secretary Chertoff is on this call with us, in the Bush administration, when we were just beginning to engage on the ideological component of the war, we were what we called the war of ideas, trying to figure out how we can stop ideological armies from being formed around the world. America was the leader in working with countries around the world to try to figure out, what can we do? How do we build resilience in people? And how can we take people who we know already decided that Al-Qaeda or whatever group that they were interested in was something that they didn't want? How do we move them away from that red line? And so you began to see programs in places like Singapore, in Saudi Arabia, and certainly some in Europe, where people were experimenting with what might work. One of the ideas was to use former extremists to work directly with somebody who's been radicalized to move them away, because there is, of course, no other authentic source to talk about the ideological conversion than somebody who had been radicalized and then de-radicalized. So you have seen the attempt to do that as well. So how do you look at somebody and say, for sure, their heart is always going to be this way, they're never going to move back? You can't 100% know what's going to happen to a human. We don't know. Behavioral change is complex. But what we can see is what doesn't work. And let me be really clear about a few things. And then I actually would love, I know that both Secretary Chertoff and Sasha have firsthand experience in looking at countries with all of this. One of the things that I ask myself when I look at this is, what are the criteria that you're using that somebody isn't radicalized? And I think what's very important is that violence piece, that you're so committed to your ideology that you're willing to do something violent, kill somebody, for example, set a bomb off somewhere, I don't know. It isn't that you're trying to convince them that America's great. You're not trying to convince them that that somehow the group that the sympathies that they might have for the cause that they've been activated to do isn't a legitimate one. That's not what the goal here. The goal here is to make sure that they aren't violent. And so I'll stop there, but those are some of the contours of the conversation we had in the past and how I think about it today.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask Sasha specifically about Germany because you've done so much work there with ISD.
Yeah, look, there are some fantastic programs that, each of which I think there's a lot of data on what has worked and what has not worked. Starting from that end of the spectrum, which is really around violent extremism and radicalization, and I can absolutely point you to fantastic studies on that. Two things just to mention. Number one is that there's been very serious government investment in that kind of programming. And that type of investment hasn't happened at scale in the United States. It is really needed. The second thing to say is we've focused very narrowly on individual radicalization and recruitment for a very long time. What we really see now, of course, is the radicalization, sort of community-based radicalization, mainstreamed radicalization, if you like. And this requires a different approach. It requires a different set of tools to address, both online and offline. It's that second part that I think actually nobody's gotten their heads around sufficiently well enough, and that we're really trying to work at. And where I think there's a much bigger return on investment. The transactional cost of doing derad work, individual by individual, is extremely high. And it's certainly no silver bullet, I will say, having worked on de-radicalization programs of that kind for 2 decades. I'd like to see us shift again into the prevention space much more firmly, and into the community de-radicalization space, which is to say shifting that cultural setting, which doesn't enable us to have that middle ground that Secretary Chertoff talked about.
Willa, can we get one more question in before we need to close?
Yes, and I think this is a good one to end on. So this question comes from Nicole. So we've seen in many instances that opposition forces have been relying on expansive First Amendment justifications to prevent many of the solutions that we've talked about today. So how do you all react to this trend, and how credible is it in your view?
Can we start with Secretary Chertoff?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important question. And I have seen that now among groups, particularly those that are taking, let's say, more extreme political positions, they're very quick to say, oh, it's a First Amendment violation. Now, I agree, when you get into content, even false content, you do have to be concerned about the First Amendment. But that doesn't mean algorithms are protected. It doesn't mean that incitement to commit a crime is protected. Instructions on how to make a bomb is not protected. Saying people ought to go down to the Capitol and show them we mean business, if it is implying violence, is not protected. So I do think that we have to be careful not to unbalance the First Amendment so that it becomes literally a protection for anything as long as you move your mouth when you do it. And so I think having eminent scholars and having the courts adopting a realistic, balanced view of the First Amendment can protect our free speech. I do, however, want to end by saying this. If we go too far in the direction of empowering the government, you got to ask yourself what happens when the person sitting in the White House is someone you don't trust to exercise that power. So as with most rules that we talk about, there's an expression, what goes around comes around, and you've got to make sure you're building a set of principles that work both when you have fair weather, but also when you have foul weather in government.
All right, Willa. Well, we actually might have time for one more if you have another one you want to tee up.
Yeah, absolutely. So our last question is a big one, so we may not cover all of it, but this question comes from Benjamin. And he says that companies that make money on an engagement-based ad-funded business model directly benefit from exactly this problem and even rely on it for their competitive advantage. Interventions that don't address this root cause may fall short. What should governmental and industry actors do to change this incentive?
Farah, or I'm sorry, Sasha, do you want to? I can see.
No, I'm
Sasha's
so sorry.
Sasha's our guru on this.
I mean,
What's
just to
your
say,
proposal?
I think that's been the focus for certainly our work at ISD and the coalitions that have been built across Europe in relation to the legislation that we now have in place at the EU level. That's exactly what it's for. It's about changing the incentive structure and making it expensive and problematic for the platforms to do the sort of thing that we've been talking about. So the systems piece of the problem, as opposed to just the content piece of the problem. And we spent years trying to get people to think about the systems, the algorithms, the products that really amplify, distort the information ecosystem and amplify threat and harm, rather than just removing pieces of content. So we now have a roadmap. It's very interesting. For a very long time, there were endless discussions about how it was simply impossible to audit an algorithm, or simply impossible to understand these platforms, too technically obtuse. Of course it is, if you don't get access to the data. And now we have a roadmap to both data access, to algorithmic oversight and accountability, to prevention through a form of duty of care and risk assessment model, which means they have to figure out what the risks might be going forward and then put in place the right measures to be able to deal with those risks, which is not rocket science and can be doable. And as responsible corporations, they must do, as we demand of other sectors, of course, to be responsible. So we absolutely have the capability to do this. Whether we have the political will to get these kinds of measures over the line is another question.
All right. Well, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for your incredible insights and for your work in these areas. So thank you very much. And Willa, thank you so much for moderating our questions.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie.
Yes,
Bye, Willa.
it's wonderful to have you all.
Good to see you.